I was 23, flat broke, and desperate. When you have 2 months of back rent breathing down your neck, you don't ask questions about a sketchy online job posting. The ad simply read, "Overnight security fire watch, solo shift, $22 an hour, must be comfortable in the dark." I needed the money, so I took it. I didn't care that the job was at the old Blackwood Meatpacking Plant. To call Blackwood massive is a severe understatement. It sits on the outskirts of a dead industrial town, a sprawling, brutalist concrete behemoth that takes up 3 city blocks. It shut down back in the early 2000s, leaving behind a terrifying labyrinth of windowless processing floors, rusted catwalks, and sub-zero freezers that haven't seen electricity in a decade. The only light inside comes from battery-powered emergency exit signs casting a dim red glow over the peeling paint and whatever my heavy-duty mag light could pierce through the pitch black. It was my first week on the job, a Thursday night in late October. The autumn air was already biting, and the chill seeped right through the thick concrete walls. My supervisor was an exhausted-looking guy named Miller who drove a beat-up truck and barely made eye contact. His instructions were simple. Walk the perimeter, check the mechanical rooms, and make sure no local copper thieves had broken in. At 10 p.m. sharp, Miller walked me to the main loading bay doors. "All right, kid," he mumbled around an unlit cigarette. "Radios have dead spots past Sector B, so don't freak out if it drops. Just stick to your route. I'll be back at 6 a.m. He stepped outside, pulled the heavy steel accordion gate shut, and I heard the unmistakable heavy clank of a thick chain being wrapped around the iron bars. Then the sharp snap of a heavy padlock. He locked me in from the outside. It was standard protocol to keep the squatters out, he'd explained on day 1, but hearing that lock click shut always made my stomach drop. I was entirely alone in a tomb of concrete and rusted metal. The first few hours of my shift were mind-numbingly monotonous, just the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of my boots echoing off the 50-foot ceilings. The atmosphere was oppressive. The place smelled strongly of wet dust, oxidized copper, and beneath it all, the faint, sickeningly sweet ghost of raw meat that the concrete floors had absorbed over 50 years of slaughter. My route took me through the main processing floor, up a set of graded metal stairs and towards Sector C, the deepest, oldest part of the plant, consisting of a dense maze of narrow corridors and defunct refrigeration units. I had walked this exact route 3 times already that week without incident, but tonight was different. I crossed the cavernous slaughter floor, my flashlight beam cutting a pale yellow swath through the suffocating darkness, and approached the heavy, sliding industrial door that led into Sector C. It was supposed to be propped open. Miller had explicitly told me it was rusted on its track and permanently wedged. I reached out, grabbed the freezing steel handle, and threw my weight backward to slide it open. It didn't budge. It felt solid, like trying to pull down a brick wall. Frowning, I stepped closer, shining my mag light directly onto the door's track and locking mechanism. My breath caught in my throat, freezing into a pale mist in the beam of the light. The thick sliding bolt had been rammed shut, and hanging from the heavy steel loop wasn't rust or cobwebs. It was a heavy-duty, pristine brass padlock. There was no dust on it, no grease. It was brand new, the metal gleaming brightly in the glare of my flashlight, and it was locked from my side of the door. Someone had bolted this section from the inside of the plant, and considering Miller had locked the only working exterior gate from the outside 3 hours ago, that meant whoever locked this door was still in the building with me. I stared at the pristine brass padlock, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation. Miller put it there, I told myself. He'd locked it before he left. But why? He specifically told me the door was jammed. And why lock it from this side, sealing off the only direct route into Sector C? I took a step back, the silence of the plant suddenly feeling less empty and more expectant. The air was dead and heavy. I reached for the radio clipped to my belt, my thumb hovering over the push-to-talk button. I wanted to call Miller, to ask him about the lock, but I remembered his warning about dead spots. And honestly, a part of me felt stupid. I was a security guard. Getting spooked by a locked door on my first week was amateur hour. Before I could press the button, a sharp, piercing beep erupted from the radio, making me jump out of my skin. It wasn't a voice transmission, it was an automated telemetry alert from the ancient security console back in the guard booth, relayed to my handset. Zone 4. Motion detected. Zone 4 was the subterranean loading dock located directly beneath Sector C. It was a massive concrete cavern that used to receive livestock deliveries off the freight trains. To get there, I couldn't use the locked door. I had to take the secondary route, a narrow, rusted metal spiral staircase that descended into the flooded sub-basement. My heart hammered against my ribs. Protocol dictated I investigate. If it was raccoons or a burst pipe, I had to log it. If I didn't, and Miller found out I ignored an alarm, I'd lose the job. I unclipped my heavy maglite, gripped the cold anodized aluminum like a club, and started toward the stairwell. The descent was agonizing. Every step on the rusted metal shrieked into the darkness. At the bottom, the air was drastically colder, thick with the smell of stagnant water, mildew, and decay. My boots splashed softly in an inch of murky water as I navigated the basement corridors, heading toward the subterranean dock. As I pushed through a set of heavy, rotting rubber flaps, the kind used in industrial freezers, the water abruptly ended, giving way to an incline of cracked concrete leading up to the subterranean bay. I swept my flashlight across the vast, empty expanse. No movement, no animals. But as the beam dragged across the thick layer of gray dust coating the floor, it illuminated something that made my blood run cold. Tire tracks. They were wide, deep treads, completely out of place in a facility that had been sealed for nearly 20 years. And they weren't old. The tracks were wet, cutting through the thick dust and leaving dark, damp impressions on the concrete. The moisture was still glistening under my flashlight beam. A heavy vehicle had driven through here recently, tonight. I traced the tracks with my light. They led straight toward the back of the bay, disappearing around the corner into the cavernous meat lockers. Suddenly, my radio crackled. It wasn't a sharp burst of an alert. It was a low, rhythmic static. Crsh, crsh. I lifted the radio, staring at the green backlit screen. The frequency dial hadn't moved. It was still on the plant's dedicated, supposedly encrypted channel. Nobody but me and Miller should have been on it. Then, through the static, a voice cut through the silence. It wasn't Miller's gruff, exhausted drawl. It was a sharp, urgent whisper. "Gates secure. He's on the east side." I froze, the breath trapped in my lungs. "Tell them to keep quiet. The rent-a-cop is wandering around down there." My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. I wasn't listening to a crossed signal from truckers on a nearby highway. I was listening to a localized transmission. They were inside the building, and they knew exactly who and where I was. Crsh, copy that. Going dark. The radio clicked off, returning to an agonizing silence. But the silence didn't last. From the darkness just around the corner where the wet tire tracks disappeared, I heard the distinct, heavy crunch of a work boot stepping on broken glass. My thumb instantly jammed the power knob on my radio, twisting it hard until it clicked off. A second later, I killed the maglite. The darkness that swallowed me wasn't just an absence of light. It felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Without the pale yellow beam of my flashlight, the subterranean loading bay was practically a void. The only illumination came from a single, dying exit sign 50 yards behind me, casting a pathetic, bloody smear across the cracked floor. I stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. Every muscle in my body was locked tight. Crunch. Another footstep on broken glass. It was maddeningly close, maybe 20 feet away, just around the corner of the heavy concrete pillar to my right. Whoever had just spoken on my frequency was moving with purpose. They weren't shuffling or stumbling like a drunk squatter. The steps were measured, heavy, tactical. My mind raced, cycling through my options. I had no weapon, just a heavy aluminum flashlight and a can of pepper spray that expired 2 years ago. The main gate was chained shut from the outside. If I ran back the way I came, my boots splashing through the flooded basement would echo like gunshots. They would hear me. They would easily catch me in the dark. I had to know what I was dealing with. If it was just two guys stripping copper wire, maybe I could slip past them into the outer corridors. Pressing my back flat against the freezing damp wall, I began to inch toward the corner. The concrete was slick with decades of grime, and the smell of stagnant water was suddenly overpowered by something sharp and completely out of place, the distinct, acrid smell of fresh cigarette smoke. I reached the edge of the pillar. My heart was battering against my ribs so violently I was terrified they could hear it. I closed my eyes, took a shallow, silent breath, and slowly leaned my head just an inch past the concrete corner to look down the corridor. I opened my eyes. At the far end of the cavernous meat locker, about 100 feet down, a massive, heavy-duty black tarp had been strung up, sectioning off the deepest part of the bay. Bleeding from behind the edges of that thick canvas was light, not the sickly red of emergency power, but the blinding, sterile white glare of high-wattage halogen work lamps. Over the pounding in my ears, a new sound registered. A low, continuous mechanical hum. A portable gas generator. Shadows danced violently against the walls of the locker, cast by the harsh white lights. I watched in mounting horror as the silhouettes of at least half a dozen men moved back and forth behind the tarp. They were hauling heavy, rectangular crates off the back of a large, unmarked box truck, the source of the wet tire tracks. This wasn't a couple of junkies looking for scrap metal. This was an organized, well-funded operation, buried in the bowels of a decommissioned plant in the middle of the night, and I was locked inside with them. A harsh, barking laugh echoed from behind the tarp, followed by the heavy thud of a crate hitting the concrete floor. "Careful with that, you idiot. You drop that, we're all dead." My blood turned to ice water. I needed to get a better vantage point, and more importantly, I needed to find a way out that didn't involve the main gate. Directly above me, disappearing into the pitch-black ceiling, was a rusted iron ladder that led up to the factory's vast network of overhead catwalks. It was the only way to move over them without being seen on the floor. I reached out, wrapping my trembling, gloved hand around the freezing iron rung of the ladder. I pulled my weight up, carefully taking my first agonizingly slow step off the ground. But as my boot left the floor, my radio, the one I had absolutely, completely turned off, let out a loud, piercing electronic chirp. That single electronic chirp echoed off the concrete walls like a gunshot. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it bruised. I snatched the radio from my belt, my fingers fumbling blindly in the pitch black. I had twisted the volume knob until it clicked, but the ancient device was a piece of junk. The battery casing was loose. Shifting my weight had caused the power to cycle, triggering the startup chime. I didn't bother with the dials. I pressed my thumb hard against the plastic latch, ripped the heavy battery pack out of the back, and shoved both pieces deep into my coat pockets. Dead silence fell over the subterranean bay. Behind the heavy black tarp 100 feet away, the harsh voices instantly ceased. The dull thud of crates stopped. The only sound left was the low, steady thrum of the gas generator. "Hold up," a voice commanded. It was the deep, authoritative one. It lacked any trace of panic, which somehow made it infinitely worse. "Did you hear that?" "Came from the loading ramp," another voice replied, low and tight. "Go check. Take the thermal." Thermal. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. If they had thermal imaging, the dark wouldn't hide me. The shadows were suddenly useless. I was only 2 rungs up the rusted iron ladder. Going back down meant splashing through the shallow puddle of condensation at the base. My only option was up. I clamped my jaw shut, ignoring the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding my mouth, and began to climb. I moved with agonizing slowness, testing every rung before trusting it with my weight. The ancient iron was coated in decades of grease and flaky rust that bit through my cheap canvas gloves. Every muscle in my arms and legs screamed in protest, strung tight with the paralyzing fear that the ladder would squeal under the strain. Down below, a brilliant beam of white light sliced around the corner of the concrete pillar I had just abandoned. I froze, clinging to the ladder 30 feet in the air like a terrified insect.
The beams swept across the cracked floor, illuminating the wet tire tracks and the empty space where I had been 10 seconds ago. A man stepped into the open. He was dressed in dark utilitarian clothing, a heavy tactical rig strapped over his chest. In one hand, he held a high-powered flashlight. In the other, sweeping the darkness with practiced, terrifying precision, was a suppressed handgun. This wasn't a burglary. This was a syndicate, a cartel, something heavily armed and brutally professional, and they were actively hunting the source of that noise. He paused directly beneath me. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my cheek against the freezing, rusted iron of the ladder, praying the cold sweat rolling down my forehead wouldn't drip. For 10 agonizing seconds, he stood there. Finally, he clicked a radio on his shoulder. "Nothing here, just an empty ramp. Must have been a rat tripping the old PA system." "Keep an eye out anyway. We're almost done here," the deep voice replied over the comms. The man turned and walked back towards the tarp. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for an hour, and resumed my climb. Faster this time. 50 feet up, my hand finally closed over the diamond plate steel grating of the overhead catwalk. I hauled myself over the guardrail, wincing as the metal groaned softly beneath my weight, and pressed my body flat against the freezing grate. I was suspended directly above the subterranean bay. From up here, the darkness was absolute, save for the massive glowing square of the black tarp below. The catwalk extended straight across the cavernous room, passing directly over their operation. If I could crawl to the other side, I could reach the stairwell that led to the old administrative offices and the secondary fire escape. I began to army crawl along the grating. The halogen lights beneath the tarp bled through the metal mesh, illuminating my hands as I dragged myself forward. I reached the center of the room, positioning myself directly above the makeshift enclosure. The tarp sagged in the middle, leaving a wide triangular gap near the top of the lighting rigs. I didn't want to look. Every survival instinct screamed at me to keep crawling, to keep my eyes glued to the dark path ahead. But I had to know what they were doing. I had to know what I was running from. I shifted my weight, leaned my face over the gap in the canvas, and peered down into the blinding white light of the operation.
I held my breath as my eyes adjusted to the blinding halogen glare bleeding through the gap in the heavy canvas. Below me, the abandoned meat locker had been transformed into a macabre, makeshift processing room. 3 large stainless steel prep tables, likely scavenged from the upper slaughter floors, were arranged under the lights. Around them stood 4 men. They were dressed in the same dark, tactical clothing as the man who had hunted me earlier, but over their gear they wore thick, industrial rubber aprons. My gaze shifted to the heavy wooden crates they had been hauling from the box truck. One of them was pried open. 2 of the men reached inside and hoisted out a heavy, elongated bundle wrapped tightly in layers of thick, opaque plastic. They heaved it onto the nearest steel table with a wet, heavy thud that made my stomach heave. It was the distinct, undeniable shape of a human body. Bile rose in the back of my throat. I pressed my gloved hand hard over my mouth to stifle a gasp. They weren't stealing copper or stripping machinery. They were using the forgotten subterranean bowels of the Blackwood plant to dispose of bodies. The gas generator wasn't just powering the lights. Thick yellow power cords snaked across the concrete floor toward a row of massive, heavy-duty chemical drums sitting in the corner, and industrial ventilation fans that had been hastily rigged to the old factory ducts. "Get the lye ready," the deep, authoritative voice echoed from just out of my line of sight. "We have 3 more to process before sunrise, and I want this place scrubbed to the concrete before we roll out." I had seen enough. This was a death sentence. If they caught me, I would end up in one of those plastic wraps, dissolved in a barrel in a factory that nobody had cared about for 2 decades. I had to get to the administrative offices. I had to find a window to break, a fire escape to climb, anything to get out of this concrete tomb. I slowly began to shift my weight backward, intending to reverse my crawl along the catwalk to the nearest stairwell. But I had forgotten just how decayed the Blackwood plant really was.
50 years of humidity, animal blood, and total neglect had eaten away at the structural integrity of the iron grating. As I transferred my weight onto my left knee to push back, the diamond plate steel beneath me let out a high-pitched, agonizing groan. I froze. Below me, the men around the table immediately stopped moving. "What was that?" one of them muttered, his voice echoing clearly up to the rafters. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I prayed to whatever was listening that the metal would hold. It didn't. With a sharp, violent crack that sounded like a rifle shot in the cavernous room, a heavily rusted support bolt snapped completely. The section of grating beneath my legs dropped violently by 2 inches, slamming against the lower iron crossbeam with a deafening clang. The sudden violent jolt knocked the heavy anodized aluminum maglite right out of my shallow coat pocket. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. I watched in helpless, paralyzing horror as the heavy black flashlight slipped through a wide gap in the rusted baseboard. It plummeted 50 feet straight down, falling right through the opening in the tarp and smashed into the concrete floor directly beside the stainless steel prep table. The glass lens shattered into 1,000 pieces with an explosive crash. Absolute, terrifying silence gripped the room. Down below, nobody breathed. Nobody moved. They all just stared at the broken flashlight on the floor. Then the deep voice spoke. It was devoid of shock, replaced entirely by a cold, calculated malice. Catwalk. Simultaneously, 6 high-powered tactical flashlights snapped upward. The brilliant, blinding white beams cut through the suffocating darkness of the rafters like spotlights, converging in a tight circle of light directly onto the rusted grating, right onto my face.
For a split second, time completely stopped. I was pinned like a moth in the blinding, intersecting beams of 6 high-powered flashlights. I couldn't see their faces behind the glare, but I didn't need to. The sheer, terrifying silence that followed my discovery communicated exactly what was about to happen. Then, the deep voice shattered the quiet. He didn't yell. He didn't sound angry. He just sounded busy. "East stairs. West stairs. Don't let him off that rig." The spell broke. Adrenaline, cold, sharp, and violently intense, exploded through my veins. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, tearing my palms open on the jagged diamond plate steel, desperate to get out of the blinding circle of light. Thwimp. Ping! A shower of orange sparks erupted 3 inches from my left hand. The sound of the suppressed gunshot was barely a whisper, a soft, pneumatic hiss, but the violent impact of the heavy-caliber bullet against the iron grate was deafening. They were shooting at me. They weren't going to ask questions, and they weren't going to intimidate me into staying quiet. They were just going to erase me. I threw myself flat, rolling out of the beam's trajectory and into the suffocating darkness of the upper rafters. Without my dropped maglite, I was completely blind. I grabbed the freezing iron handrail, hauled myself to my feet, and started running. Every blind step on the suspended catwalk was a terrifying gamble. The rusted metal shrieked and bounced violently under my heavy boots. I kept my left hand sliding tightly along the railing, using it to guide me through the pitch-black void, praying the guardrail wouldn't suddenly give way and send me plummeting 50 feet under the concrete floor below. Beneath me, the subterranean bay erupted into calculated chaos. Heavy boots pounded against the concrete, echoing off the high ceiling. But the sounds that truly paralyzed me with terror were coming from either end of the massive room. Clang, clang, clang. They were already on the stairs. I could hear the rapid, heavy footfalls of tactical boots scaling the metal stairwells on both the east and west walls. They were flanking me. The catwalk I was on stretched directly across the center of the bay, connecting the 2 stairwells. If I stayed on this path, they would trap me right in the middle. I forced my legs to move faster, my breath tearing through my throat in ragged, burning gasps. My eyes wildly searched the darkness for any alternative route. As my hand slid along the railing, it caught hard on a junction box. I collided heavily with a vertical steel beam, a fork. To my right,
A narrower secondary gantry branched off from the main walkway. It led away from the stairwells and straight into the gaping black maw of the factory's main processing floor, the old slaughter line. Suddenly, I heard the metallic squeal of the heavy fire door at the top of the east stairwell being kicked open. A brilliant beam of white light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the far end of the catwalk. "He's on the upper deck, pushing west," a voice barked over a radio. Less than 50 yards away, the west stairwell door banged open. Another beam of light pierced the gloom. They had both ends of the main catwalk locked down. I threw myself onto the secondary gantry, dropping to my hands and knees just as the two flashlight beams violently swept across the junction where I had been a fraction of a second prior. I crawled frantically into the narrow, claustrophobic tunnel of the processing line conveyor. It was a metal housing meant for heavy machinery, barely 4 feet high. The smell of decades-old dried blood and oxidized iron in the enclosed space was overpowering. "Hold," a voice commanded from the main catwalk, dangerously close. The heavy footsteps immediately stopped. He didn't make it to the stairs. He went into the meat tracks. I held my breath, pressing my face flat into a puddle of freezing congealed grease on the floor of the conveyor housing. "Get the thermal optic up here and flush him out."
I knew exactly what thermal optic meant. My body heat was a glowing neon beacon in this freezing 50-degree factory. If I stayed pressed against the floor of the metal housing, they wouldn't even need to stick their heads inside to find me. They would see my bright red silhouette through the thin, rusted sheet metal and simply shoot me right through the floorboards. I had to keep moving. The meat track was a suffocating rectangular iron tunnel suspended high above the main slaughter floor. It was designed to transport massive hanging animal carcasses via automated chains, not conceal a terrified, fully grown man. I dragged myself forward on my belly, my elbows and knees scraping agonizingly against the rough iron floor. The darkness inside was absolute. I was navigating purely by touch, practically swimming through decades of congealed grease and decaying rot. Thick, heavy iron meat hooks dangled from the ceiling track every few feet. As I crawled, my shoulder brushed against one. It swung backward, hitting the metal wall with a dull clink. The sound was microscopic, but in the dead silence of the factory, it might as well have been a siren. "He's moving," a voice echoed from the mouth of the tunnel behind me. The sound funneled down the metal housing, making it seem like the man was whispering directly into my ear. I heard the heavy metallic groan of the grating as someone hoisted their weight onto the secondary gantry. "Got the thermal," a second, gruffer voice replied. "Give me a second to calibrate. The ambient temp in here is messing with the wash." Panic, pure and primal, seized my chest. I scrambled faster, abandoning any attempt at total stealth. I blindly grabbed the dangling meat hooks with my bare, bleeding hands as I passed them, holding them still to muffle the sound before lunging forward again. My breath roared in my ears. The claustrophobia was crushing me. The walls of the tunnel felt like they were shrinking, pressing the suffocating smell of oxidized iron and old blood deep into my lungs. Behind me, a faint, pale green glow suddenly washed over the corrugated walls of the tunnel. It was the backlight of the thermal monitor, illuminating the pitch-black space just enough for me to see the horrifyingly narrow confines of my trap. "Got a heat bloom," the gruff voice announced, utterly devoid of emotion. 50 feet down the track, crawling away. The terrifying metallic clack of a rifle bolt being pulled back and locked into place echoed down the tunnel. "Take the shot, center mass." I threw my body flat against the floor just as a pneumatic thwip cut through the air. A heavy caliber bullet punched clean through the right wall of the tunnel, tearing a jagged hole in the rusted sheet metal mere inches from my ribs. A second shot immediately followed, striking a dangling meat hook just above my head and sending a shower of sharp, rusty shrapnel raining down onto the back of my neck. I lunged forward in blind, animalistic terror, scrambling on all fours to get out of the fatal bottleneck. And then, the floor simply vanished. My hands slapped at empty space. My upper body pitched forward into a sudden freezing updraft. I flailed wildly, my heavy work boots catching on a thick iron lip at the very last second. I slammed hard against the edge, the wind completely knocked out of my lungs, my torso hanging precariously over a massive vertical abyss. The meat track didn't just end, it emptied directly into a vertical 4-foot-wide steel rendering chute that plunged straight down into the absolute echoing darkness of the lower sublevels. Behind me, the pale green light grew brighter, the slow, rhythmic scrape of tactical knee pads crawling into the tunnel. "Target is stopped at the drop-off," the radio crackled, the hunter's voice now less than 30 feet behind me. "I have a clean line of sight on his back." I stared down into the pitch-black void of the chute, the cold air rushing up against my face. I had a fraction of a second to decide. Take a bullet to the spine or let go. I didn't allow myself to hesitate. The moment I heard the sharp, metallic intake of breath from the hunter behind me, I simply let go of the iron lip. A suppressed bullet hissed through the empty space where my head had been a fraction of a second prior, sparking violently against the far wall of the chute, but I was already falling. The drop wasn't a free fall. The rendering chute was angled just enough to send me sliding down the pitch-black steel tube at a terrifying speed. The metal was ice cold and coated in decades of hardened, rancid grease that offered zero friction. Jagged seams in the rusted steel tore right through my thick canvas work coat, scraping a layer of skin off my back and shoulders. The deafening metallic roar of my body sliding down the chute echoed like a freight train in the confined space. It felt like an eternity of absolute plunging darkness before the chute finally spat me out. I launched into the air, falling another 10 feet before crashing violently into a massive iron catch basin. The impact was brutal. I slammed shoulder first into a mound of damp, yielding debris, a putrid mixture of rotting cardboard, hardened chemical runoff, and decaying burlap sacks that had accumulated over 20 years. The wind was instantly knocked from my lungs in a ragged, agonizing wheeze. My right shoulder flared with a blinding, white-hot pain, completely dislocated or broken, I couldn't tell which. I lay in the darkness, gasping for air that tasted like pure ammonia and wet rot. "He took the rendering drop," a voice echoed faintly down the metal tube above me, distorted but urgent. "Sector D catch basins. He's trapped down there. Go, go, go!" Pain or no pain, I had to move. If they found me still lying in the basin, they would execute me without a second thought. I bit down hard on my lower lip, tasting warm copper, and forced myself to roll over. Using only my good left arm, I dragged my battered body over the rusted rim of the catch basin and collapsed onto the solid concrete floor of the sub-basement. The darkness down here was entirely absolute. There were no emergency exit signs, no windows, just a suffocating, freezing void. I pushed myself to my feet, leaning heavily against the nearest wall, which was covered in slick, cracked subway tile. I began to blindly limp down the corridor, keeping my left hand pressed flush against the wet tiles to guide me. Every step sent a sickening jolt of pain up my right side, but the sound of heavy steel doors slamming open somewhere in the distance fueled my panic. They were already in the sub-basement. "Sweep the line," the deep, authoritative voice commanded. The acoustics of the tiled basement carried his words with terrifying clarity. "2 men on the basins, the rest of you, fan out. He's injured. He's not getting far." My hand brushed against the sharp edge of a metal door frame. I stumbled through the opening, my boots echoing softly against a grated iron floor. The air in this room was drastically colder, and the floor was vibrating faintly from the massive gas generator running somewhere far above. Sweeping my hand out in the dark, my knuckles struck cold, curved steel. A vat. I felt along the surface, realizing I had stumbled into a storage room filled with massive industrial holding tanks. A sudden, brilliant sweep of white light cut through the hallway outside the room. The beam bounced off the tiled walls, illuminating the doorway I had just walked through. The heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots was marching directly toward me. Panic seized my chest. I couldn't outrun them, and I couldn't fight.
I traced the curved steel of the nearest vat until my hand hit a heavy metal latch, an inspection hatch. I grabbed it, hauling it open. The hinges screamed in protest, but the sound was masked by the heavy footsteps echoing outside. I scrambled backward into the freezing metallic belly of the empty tank, pulling my legs in tight. I reached out to pull the heavy hatch shut, but the rusted hinges jammed. It wouldn't close completely, leaving a 2-inch vertical crack of open space. I froze as 2 blinding flashlight beams swept into the room, their bright white light slicing right through the crack in my hatch, illuminating the horrifyingly cramped space I was trapped in. And then the footsteps stopped, right outside my tank.
The cold, curved steel of the industrial vat pressed against my spine, leaching the last remnants of body heat from my shivering frame. My dislocated right shoulder throbbed with a sickening hot pulse that made my vision swim, but I couldn't afford to pass out. I pulled my knees tight to my chest, making myself as small as physically possible in the pitch-black metallic belly of the tank. Through the 2-inch vertical crack in the jammed hatch, a brilliant sliver of white light violently sliced into my dark tomb. Dust motes danced in the beam. "Check the tanks," a voice muttered. It was so close that the rusted steel of my vat seemed to vibrate with the baritone frequency. Heavy tactical boots crunched slowly across the grated iron floor of the storage room. Clang. The hunter struck the side of the tank nearest the door with something heavy, likely the barrel of his suppressed rifle. "Empty," he called out. He took 3 measured steps toward me. A heavy shadow suddenly eclipsed the sliver of light. He was standing directly in front of my hatch. I stopped breathing. I clamped my left hand ruthlessly over my nose and mouth, biting down on my own fingers to stifle the ragged, panicked gasps my lungs were begging to take. The localized smell of decades-old dried chemical runoff inside the vat was suffocating, burning the back of my throat like acid. The beam of his tactical light shot directly through the 2-inch gap. It swept across the fabric of my canvas coat, missing my face by a fraction of an inch. If he leaned forward just a single millimeter to peer through the crack, he would see me staring back at him. "Hey," the hunter said softly. His voice lacked the frantic energy of the chase. It was the cold, confident tone of someone who had just cornered their prey. "Got fresh blood on the grate here, leading right up to this unit." He tapped the metal rim of my hatch with his gun barrel. Tink. "Hatch is jammed," he added. "Pull it open," the second hunter ordered from across the room, "and step back when you do." My left hand frantically patted my utility belt, my fingers trembling violently. I bypassed the empty flashlight loop and closed my fist around my only remaining defense, the canister of pepper spray that had expired 2 years ago. It was a pathetic, laughable weapon against a heavily armed cartel cleaner, but it was the only card I had left to play. I gripped the small aerosol can, sliding my thumb under the plastic safety flap. The shadow shifted as the man in front of me grabbed the rusted external handle of the hatch. The metal hinges shrieked like a dying animal as he braced his heavy boot against the curved steel of the tank and yanked backward. The 2-inch crack violently widened to 4 inches, then 6. As his face appeared in the opening, framed by the blinding backlight of his dropped flashlight, his eyes squinting to pierce the gloom of the tank, I shoved my arm through the gap, aimed the nozzle directly at his nose, and held down the trigger. A thick, concentrated orange stream of expired oleorescent capsicum blasted point-blank into his open mouth. He didn't yell. He screamed, a raw, wet, agonizing sound of pure shock and blinding pain. His hands instantly flew to his burning face, and the heavy suppressed rifle clattered loudly onto the iron grating. This was my only window. I didn't think, I just reacted with pure animalistic adrenaline. I brought both of my heavy work boots up and kicked the rusted hatch outward with every single ounce of strength I had left in my legs. The heavy steel door swung open like a battering ram, slamming brutally into the blinded hunter's chest. The impact lifted him off his feet, sending him crashing backward into the second hunter who was rushing over to help. They both went down in a tangled heap of tactical gear and agonizing curses.
I scrambled out of the vat, dragging my useless right arm, and bolted blindly through the doorway, plunging back into the suffocating pitch-black labyrinth of the sub-basement corridors. I didn't know where I was running. I just knew I had to find a stairwell to the surface before they recovered their weapons.
I ran until my lungs felt like they were filling with shattered glass. Behind me, the muffled, agonizing curses in the vat room morphed into barking, frantic orders. I heard the unmistakable, terrifying clatter of a heavy rifle being scooped off the iron grate. "He's heading for the old boiler tracks. Cut him off!" I didn't have a flashlight. I didn't have a radio. I just kept my left hand dragging along the freezing, wet, tiled wall of the sub-basement, blindly navigating the labyrinth and praying it would lead to an upward slope. Every desperate step sent a sickening jolt of agony radiating from my dislocated right shoulder, but the primal fear of what they were doing with those chemical drums pushed me forward. Suddenly, the tiled wall ended. My hand met the sharp, rusted corner of a door frame, and a faint, blessed draft of freezing night air hit my face. It smelled like dead leaves and frost, not rust, mold, and old blood. I stumbled through the doorway and felt the steep incline of the concrete ramp beneath my boots. It was a subterranean ash chute leading to the ground-level loading alleys. I clawed my way up the slope in the pitch black, my boots slipping on loose debris and hardened grease. At the top was a heavy wooden double door. I threw my entire body weight against it. It didn't budge. Panic seized my throat like a vice. I slammed my good left shoulder against the rotting wood once, twice, 3 times, screaming in exertion as the rusted lock finally gave way and the wood splintered outward. I spilled out onto the frozen, overgrown asphalt of the factory's rear alley. I didn't stop to look back. I bolted into the dense dead woods surrounding the perimeter fence, ignoring the thorny branches tearing at my face and coat. I ran for nearly 2 miles through the dark until the harsh, fluorescent glow of a 24-hour gas station broke through the tree line. I burst through the glass doors, covered in black grease, wet rust, and my own blood, screaming for the terrified attendant behind the plexiglass to call 911. By the time the county police arrived in force, the sun was just beginning to bleed a pale gray over the horizon. I sat in the back of an ambulance, a foil shock blanket wrapped tightly around my trembling shoulders, watching as 24 heavily armed tactical officers breached the chained main gates of the Blackwood plant. My supervisor, Miller, had been dragged out of bed by the cops and was standing by the perimeter tape, looking genuinely terrified and completely out of his depth. I gave the detectives every single detail. The pristine padlock, the wet tire tracks, the heavy tarp, the bodies wrapped in thick plastic, the suppressed rifles, the thermal optics, and the vat room. I told them exactly where to look in Sector C. 3 hours later, the lead detective walked out of the massive concrete plant, his expression grim and completely unreadable. He walked over to the open doors of my ambulance. "We checked the subterranean bay," he said quietly, flipping a small notepad shut, "and the vat room and the meat tracks." "Did you find them?" I rasped, my voice raw and shaking. The detective shook his head slowly. "We didn't find anyone, son. We found your smashed mag light on the concrete floor. We found a snapped bolt on the upper catwalk, but there's no box truck, no tarp, no generator, and absolutely no bodies." My stomach dropped out of my body. That's impossible. They were setting up an entire processing operation down there. They shot at me. The entire floor of that subterranean bay was soaked in industrial bleach and raw lye. Whatever was down there, they packed it up and scrubbed the concrete down to the pores before the sun came up. They didn't even leave a single shell casing behind. They had vanished like ghosts, but they weren't ghosts. They were a highly organized, brutally efficient syndicate that had managed to completely erase a mass disposal site in the dark in under 4 hours. I quit the security company that exact morning. I packed whatever fit into my beat-up sedan and left the state by noon. The police promised to keep an eye on the facility, but without hard evidence, my case was just a bizarre incident report sitting in a filing cabinet in a dying town. It's been 3 years. I live 1,000 miles away, and I work a boring, heavily populated daytime desk job. But I still check the locks on my doors 3 times every single night. because every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the blinding beam of that flashlight slicing through the dark, and the chilling realization that they saw my face, they knew my patrol route, and they are still out there.